My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you here today for our webinar, A Mission of Reconciliation and Justice in Israel-Palestine Today. Here in Canada, we begin most of our sessions with a land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which many of us call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit each in our own way to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. There are a couple of housekeeping things to address before we get started. Today's session and David's next session will be 90 minutes. This will include the presentation time and time for questions and answers. Please enter your questions and answers in the Q&A box, or your questions. They may be missed if you put them in the chat box. Recordings of each session will be sent to registered participants within 72 hours. I'm going to turn it over to Jose Sanchez, our Director of Communications, who will take a moment to speak about translation and other technical issues.
Thank you, Pat. And I will switch to French for this. Alors, pour choisir la langue de votre préférence, si vous êtes sur un ordinateur, dans les commandes de votre session, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation et après cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Si vous êtes sur un appareil mobile, dans les contrôles de votre réunion, appuyez sur le bouton avec les 3 petits points au plus et après appuyez sur Interprétation de la langue. Appuyez après sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. L'interprétation linguistique n'est pas disponible lorsque vous accédez à Zoom sur un navigateur web. Also, as Pat said, remember you can ask questions through the questions and answer button, also at the bottom or top of the screen, depending on your device. And questions will be answered towards the end of the session. Again, a recording of the session will be shared by 3 business days after today. And if you have technical questions, you can reach me using the chat box and I will try to assist you. Thank you, Pat.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you Father David Newhouse. David Mark Newhouse is a superior of the Society of Jesus Jesuit community in the Holy Land. He teaches scripture in various institutions in Israel and Palestine. He completed a BA, MA, and PhD in political science at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. He then completed pontifical degrees in theology and scripture in Paris and Rome. He is Emeritus Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel and coordinator of the pastoral among immigrants and asylum seekers in Israel. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of meeting David many years ago when I was a student at Bat Kol Institute in Jerusalem. My mentor, Sister Marina Fritz, brought in engaging professors like David to enrich our learning. Over the years, David and I have met numerous times with students from Regis College in Toronto when they traveled to Israel, Palestine. I've also worked with David at the Notre Dame de Sion Center for Biblical Studies in Jerusalem, which is a wonderful institute that offers courses in scripture for people from around the world. Thank you for being with us, David.
Thank you very much, Pat. I do have to start with a little correction. I'm no longer, thanks be to God, superior of the Jesuit community in Jerusalem.
Oh.
I ended my service on the Feast of St. Ignatius just a month ago. So we give thanks to God for that. I am very happy and to be able to speak to you, and I thank you very much for this invitation. I will be using a PowerPoint so that we can follow through the presentation. And as was already mentioned, this will be a presentation in two parts. I will be dealing this evening with a bit of history, and again, it will be fast, maybe too fast, but I try to make it as simple as possible so that we get a sense of the terminology of the conflict and its origins. Next week, I will be speaking a little more about the present and even the future as we look at how this conflict might work itself out. Of course, I'm not a prophet, so this will be based upon a personal understanding of where we might be heading. So I will open now the PowerPoint presentation. And I hope that everybody sees more or less what I see. A mission of reconciliation and justice in Israel-Palestine today. And here I am as a member of the Jesuit community in the Holy Land. I might mention, because it might be of some relevance to some of you, that I'm also a very active member of our local Roman Catholic, in fact, Catholic, not only Roman Catholic, Justice and Peace Commission connected to our Bishops' Conference, which includes the bishops of all the different Catholic rites in the Holy Land. So again, our first, and that's what number one means, it means today, we'll be dealing with the history and development of the conflict since 1917. And that needs a little bit of explanation. Why 1917? So I think that this is when the modern conflict in the Holy Land more or less begins. Again, many will point out that there have been long centuries of conflict in the Holy Land. That perhaps is a little exaggerated, as we have also known times of peace. But what happened in 1917 is that 400 years of Ottoman Turkish rule ended. And so a little word about the Holy Land until 1917. We're talking about a small region within a very enormous Ottoman Empire. Of course, a very important region, not because of its great population or its wealth, but because the eyes of the faithful, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, are focused on this land where so many of the holy sites are. We are speaking about a population that we can term a Palestinian population. Again, the word might be controversial for some, but we're talking about a territory that has been known over many centuries as Palestine, as Israel, as the Holy Land, a population in which the vast majority are Muslims, Christians, a small minority, and Jews, a small minority, most of them Arabic speaking, Arabic being the language of this land already for centuries. And in 1917, in the course of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany, lost to the British and ceded the Holy Land to British rule. In fact, let's look at these pictures. Here in the central picture, we have the entry of General Allenby into the old city of Jerusalem. This would be in December 1917. And here we have a group of Palestinian Arabs. I will point out that it's not possible to know whether they are Christians or Muslims. In fact, they might very well be Christians from the area of Bethlehem. And on the other side, Palestinian Jews, most likely also Arabic speakers. We're talking about the period leading up to 1917. Now, in 1917, and this is why I go back to this date to begin this description of the conflict as it has evolved over the last decades, a very important document was signed, in fact, about 6 weeks before the British marched into Jerusalem. The document is called the Balfour Declaration, published on the 2nd of November, 1917. Again, I'll explain here the photographs that you see on the screen. Here is Lord Arthur Balfour, who would have been the Foreign Secretary of the British Empire, the man responsible for foreign affairs. And a letter was published, signed by him, addressed to one of the leading British Jews, Lord Rothschild, and it concerned the British vision for the future of Palestine. Remember, please, this is 6 weeks before the British marched into Palestine, meaning they were talking about a territory that was not yet controlled by them, that was still being ruled by the Turks. But in typical imperial style, in a language that echoes very strongly with the colonialism that was rife at that time, Lord Arthur Balfour makes a commitment to the Zionists, and we'll say in a minute what does that mean, but here we have the head of the Zionist organization in England at that time. His name is Chaim Weizmann. He would later become the first president of the State of Israel in 1948. And he makes that commitment in this letter to Lord Rothschild that in Palestine there would be a Jewish homeland. Again, we're talking about a land until that time controlled by the Ottoman Turks. The majority of the population are Muslims, a small minority of Jews, a small minority of Christians. We'll see in a moment some of the statistics as they change over the course of the 20th century. But the promise is made to the Zionist organization that indeed the British are committed to setting up a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As a kind of afterthought and something that is not regularly remembered, there is a second paragraph to this declaration that says that this all would be done without endangering the rights of the local indigenous population of Palestinians, referring, of course, predominantly to Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And here on the other side of the screen, we have one of the most important leaders of the Palestinian Muslim population, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who would become one of the very forceful spokespeople against both British colonialism and Zionist colonization. I have put a fourth picture here because within the British cabinet, there was one man who stood out in his opposition to the Balfour Declaration. His name was Edwin Montagu. Interestingly, he was the minister responsible for India, and he opposed strongly the Balfour Declaration. It is interesting to point out that he was the only Jew in the British cabinet at the time, and part of his resistance was this talk of a Jewish homeland when he insisted so strongly that his homeland was England, and he didn't need a homeland somewhere far off in the Middle East that was inhabited by an indigenous population. Now, what led the British to support this idea that a Jewish homeland should be set up in Palestine? And I'd like to point out two very strong motivations. First of all, I go back to what I said earlier before I go to the two motivations. We are talking about a time of colonialism when Europe basically felt that it had the right to rule the world. And that, of course, was also strongly the case in terms of Palestine. The British are seeing themselves now reconnected with the Christian heartland, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the holy places, saw that this was now to become part of the British Empire. But it needs to be pointed out also that Lord Arthur Balfour and the British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, were very, very much concerned as humanists with the fate of the Jewish people in Europe, and particularly in Russia, where the Jews had faced already decades of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go into a very detailed and precise definition of what is anti-Semitism, because I'm imagining that most of our listeners are completely understand the term. But anti-Semitism I will simply define as hatred towards the Jewish people, a lack of willingness to live together with Jews within the countries of Europe, North America, or wherever this disease is found, anti-Semitism. And so David Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, and many others in England were very, very concerned with the fate of Jews being forced out of Russia, facing pogroms, meaning attacks of severe violence, leaving many dead, and an unwillingness of the Russian establishment at the time of the imperial rule in Russia to allow the Jews to be integrated into the Russian population. So, colonialism, one strong motivation. This is part of our empire. And then therein, in this land, we will found a Jewish homeland for this people that has known so much suffering. I have added here, of course, next to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. Islamophobia is the fear and hatred of Islam and Muslims, which certainly also plays a part in this at this time. Arthur Balfour and David Lloyd George would have ignored very much the fear of Muslims, the hatred of Muslims that becomes a part also of what goes on in Palestine and in the Middle East in general. Now we come to Zionism, and it needs to be explained that there are two forms to Zionism, parallel forms. Zionism, Zion, in the Bible means Jerusalem. And of course, there are very strong underlying biblical themes that come to play in this vision for Palestine that is being formulated by people like Arthur Balfour and David Lloyd George, who are very strongly believing Protestants. They read their Bibles. They believe that somehow those promises of old need to be realized in their time. That God, and this of course is a language that I don't personally adopt, but is part of Christian Zionist language, God, according to them clearly in the Bible, has made a promise to the Jewish people that Palestine is the homeland for Jews. And then of course we have, in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of a political Jewish Zionism, meaning not only a religious longing for Jerusalem, a longing for the coming of the Messiah, which was a spiritual longing, but actually the birth of a political movement that looks at the problem of anti-Semitism and says there is no solution other than the adoption of a type of Jewish nationalism that eventually sees Palestine as the national homeland. And Chaim Weizmann was able to present these ideas to ears that were willing to listen in the British cabinet, in British society. Again, we're talking about the year 1917. And then, of course, developing alongside Zionism with other nationalisms all over Europe and penetrating into the Middle East will be forms of nationalism that are Palestinian, Arab, meaning general Arab nationalism in the Arab world that sees the Arab people as one rather than divided up into nation states, which are pretty much European creations in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, etc., etc. And then a kind of much greater Muslim solidarity. And so here we see the roots of a clash that will be taking place over the next decades after 1917, the British colonial rule. Jews who in the beginning were not overly enthusiastic with Zionism, but because of the growing threat of anti-Semitism, are slowly but surely seeing that Zionism perhaps might be the only solution to their Jewish problem in Europe. particularly in Europe. And the third element in this conflict are a Palestinian nationalism or a broader Arab nationalism or a sense of Muslim solidarity in which, again, Jerusalem will become a very important symbol. So the British take over Palestine, and that takeover is recognized by the League of Nations, that international body that preceded the United Nations between the two world wars. And the Balfour Declaration became an inherent part of British rule. In other words, the British government saw as one of the goals that they needed to accomplish the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This, of course, meant that the British would facilitate Jewish migration to Palestine. When the Balfour Declaration was signed, when the Balfour Declaration was sent to Lord Rothschild, there were 60,000 Jews in Palestine, 600,000, 650,000 Palestinian Arabs who were not Jews, Muslims and Christians. By 1922, we see that the number of Jews has increased, and it will continue to increase over the decades of British rule. The British would rule Palestine from the end of 1917 to the middle of 1948. Tens of thousands of Jews would be migrating to Palestine. In fact, hundreds of thousands of Jews when we get into the late 1920s and 1930s, and of course, after the Second World War, with the terrible event of the Shoah during the Second World War that convinced even more Jews that they had no home among the family of nations and they needed a home of their own. Of course, as the migration increased, so Palestinian Arabs increased their resistance both to the colonial rule that facilitated this incredible influx of people who they saw as European colonials, Jews coming from Europe. And so there were outbreaks of violence all through the 1920s and the 1930s as Palestinian Arabs and Jews clashed, and both of them resisted the continuing control of Palestine by the British. It would have been only in the mid-1930s, beginning perhaps as late as 1936, and that was the beginning of the Great Arab Revolt against British rule and against Zionism, 1936 to 1939, that the two populations, Jews and Arabs in Palestine, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Arabs, became completely distinct from one another. There was a polarization as it became clear that these two populations would not be able to live together in peace. By the time we reach 1948, and again, I want to stress that as we reach 1948, Jewish migration to Palestine has become a flood. The people liberated from the death camps in Europe after that horrific attempt to wipe out the Jewish people in Europe has become a flood of survivors and people fleeing, people who now are absolutely convinced of the need for a Jewish homeland. I again point out that at the beginning, Zionism was certainly not an option adopted by all Jews. Many Jews felt that their real future lay in their countries where they were born, whether they would be integrated and become an active part of society, politics, culture, as they had always been, although from the margins. By the time we reach the years 1947 and 1948, again, decisive years in the history of the region, the population is, and you can see here, we have 1.3 million Arabs, Christians and Muslims. The Christians would have been about 10%. And we have a population of over 600,000 Jews. Again, the vast majority of them, remember that when the Balfour Declaration was signed, there were 60,000 Jews in Palestine. this number has swelled to 630,000. 2/3 of the population are Arabs, 1/3 of the population are Jews. Again, we spoke in 1917 of Palestinian Arabs being Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Arabic-speaking Jews, who were to some degree, like the Christians, integrated into general society. But the decades of British rule, the increasing violence and polarization have led these two populations to become very separate. And as the violence increased, the British realized that they could no longer rule Palestine, and so they made preparation to leave. But before they did, they handed over the problem to the United Nations. And before we look at what the United Nations proposed, I just want to say that in 1948, British rule came to an end. Here we see the British Governor-General departing from Palestine. We see the proclamation of a Jewish state called the State of Israel. The founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, his portrait, he died in 1904. He did not see the realization of his political program. The first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out the Declaration of Independence, celebration for the Jews. But on the other side, a catastrophe for the Palestinians as the Palestinians become a refugee people. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee their homes, never to return. But let's go back and look over this period of incredible violence in the Holy Land that actually begins in November 1947. For it is in November 1947, and we see this in this map over here, which would be on the left side of the screen. We see the map that was proposed by the United Nations when the British turned to the United Nations and said, we are unable to rule this land. There is a civil war going on. Jews and Arabs are Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, and the Jews who have come are organized, of course, within the cadre of the Zionist organization, are engaged in a civil war. They want an end to British rule, and they're fighting against one another. So the United Nations, and again, remember, this is 1947, 2 years after the Jewish people have emerged, those that survived, of course, not the 6 million who died, but those who survived the death camps have emerged. Europe is very, very much impregnated with the images of a crucified Jewish people, a people that has been put to death in the death camps of the Nazis. 2 years later, they make a decision that indeed the Jewish people should have a homeland in Palestine. And they present the following map, and you see here, I hope that it's clear enough for you to see, the blue area would be the proposed Jewish state, and the orange area would be the proposed Arab state. I'll give you the statistics. 56% of the land of Palestine, west of the Jordan River, east of the Mediterranean, 56% of that territory would become a Jewish state, and 44% would become a Palestinian state. You see a little pink area in the middle, which is the area of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and even a little area here, the port of Jaffa, that would be an internationally controlled area governed by the United Nations according to this plan for a period of 10 years in order to see how the two states would develop alongside one another. I do want to point out, and here is where there's such a conflict of narrative. On the one side, there was great rejoicing on the 29th of November, 1947, by Jews who said, now we will have that state, we will have that place to be safe. But great, great disappointment on the side of the Palestinians who said, we thought that the colonial age was ending. The European powers are withdrawing from their colonies, and slowly but surely, one after the other, nations are becoming free. And what about us? We are now landed with a permanent colonial, European colonial presence in our midst. Our land is taken. Let us remember, of course, that the vast majority of Jews who had come as refugees had arrived within the last 15, 20 years, and now were being given territories that were composed of lands, ancestral lands of a Palestinian people that was expected, without having even been consulted, to make space for this Jewish state. Now, in actual fact, as extreme violence broke out from November 1947, and when the British left in May 1948, it became a regional war as Arab countries around the newly proclaimed State of Israel supposedly came to the aid of the Palestinian people. I say supposedly came to the aid, and we won't go into that much, but did they really help the Palestinian people? That remains to be seen as archives are continually opened, history books are written, analyses show that many of those regimes were corrupt and in collusion with the colonial powers and probably didn't do very much to help the Palestinian people. But the result of the war, the armistice was signed in January 1949, we see in this map over here, where we see that it was not 56% of the land that became the Jewish state, but 78% of the land, because the borders were defined by the hostilities that went on until January 1949, and the Zionist forces that became the Israelis, the Israeli army, was able to conquer 78% of the territory, not only the territory handed to them by the United Nations, but additional territories that were supposed to have been part of the Arab state. And the Palestinians received nothing for the remaining 22% of the land. Here, the West Bank, what we call still the West Bank, was annexed by Jordan. And here, the Gaza Strip to the south was occupied by Egypt. And so, yes, on the one side, rejoicing as the state of Israel is born, a persecuted people, particularly a persecuted people in Europe, finds some kind of security in a national sovereign state recognized by the world community. But on the other side, a Palestinian people, and the word in Arabic says, a Nakba, the catastrophe, is turned into a refugee people as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee their lands and are turned into refugees and are still waiting as refugees for a resolution to this terrible conflict. But of course, we're only in 1947, 1948. What would happen only 19 years later, and we jump over those early years of the State of Israel, when the State of Israel, gathering in millions of Jews from all over the world, Jews flocking to a state that they could call their own and building it up in incredible ways with the help, of course, of a Western Christian world that has awakened to the horrific nature of anti-Semitism, to the terrible crimes of the Shoah. And so aid pours in to the new state from the United States, from Europe, in a particular way from Germany, and in the first 6-7 years of the State of Israel, also from the Soviet Union. And in those 19 years, the Palestinians who have stayed inside the State of Israel live under military rule, but it would not be a stable situation that would be instituted. Rather, wars continued, violence continued. And in the years leading up to 1967, the violence intensified as Palestinian refugees sent over groups of armed men that attacked Israeli settlements on lands that they considered their own. And Israel sent out groups, military groups, to attack the Palestinians in the neighboring countries, and a major war would break out in 1967. By this time, the world is divided because of the Cold War into two blocks, and Israel would be solidly on the side of the United States, whereas the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world would be more associated with the Soviet Union. The result of this very brief 1967 war was, again, victory for the Israelis, as Israel took control not only of all the territories in historic Palestine, taking control of the West Bank, taking control of the Gaza Strip, but also taking what is known as the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel, in 1967, June 1967, won an incredible victory, but that victory would be a very ambiguous one, as now Israel faced the challenge of governing a huge Palestinian population and put these territories under a military regime known as the occupation. To some extent, this reality continues today, even though there have been changes that we'll look at in a moment. This map, although Sinai was returned as part of a peace agreement with Egypt, this map remains to some degree the map of Israel today. What happened in the ongoing periods after the 1967 war is that the Palestinians, who had decided just before the 1967 war to take their fate into their own hands, no longer rely on the Arab regimes to defend them, and had founded an organization known as the Palestine Liberation Organization. They started to organize armed resistance to the occupation, and not only in Palestine, but also overseas. The Israelis became more and more aware that the constant threat to security of Israel came from a population that had not received any form of recognition. And so, starting from 1987, when a general insurrection broke out in the territories occupied by Israel, we call this the Intifada, more and more Israelis became aware that something had to be done. Perhaps a military victory was not enough. And so finally in 1993, very much guided by the United States government, Israelis and Palestinians began to meet and began to talk to one another to see if it would be possible to come to some kind of agreement about how they could share the land, the Holy Land. Now, it's very interesting. Today is the 13th of September, and it was exactly 29 years ago that something that brought a lot of hope, even if only for a very short time, took place on the lawns of the White House. During the presidency of Bill Clinton, Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, was brought together with Yasser Arafat, who was then the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And on those lawns of the White House, they signed accords that were supposed to start putting an end to the Palestine-Israel conflict. Unfortunately, that optimism did not last for very long. Perhaps a part of the problem was that these accords were very much imposed by the United States government, that the Israelis still believed that there could be victory, that the Palestinians were perhaps a little bit too naive in thinking that the way now was open to some kind of peace agreement. What these accords did was, in fact, they broke the territories that were occupied by Israel into small areas under different forms of government. What you see here in red are areas that were under Palestinian rule, areas A. The big cities, Ramallah, Nablus, Jericho, Bethlehem, and to some degree Hebron, Tulkarem, Qalqilia, these were supposedly going to be directly under Palestinian control. And then areas B, where there were major areas of residence of Palestinians, would be under shared control. But Israel in the initial period would still control most of the West Bank, and the Israeli army would have freedom of movement in most of this area. This was supposed to be an initial situation, a situation to build up confidence. Of course, you see that Jerusalem, which is at the very center of the conflict, Palestinians claim it as their capital. Israelis have made it their capital. Israelis have annexed all of Jerusalem, meaning a part of Jerusalem became legally, internationally recognized part of Israel in 1948. But the areas that were conquered in 1967 were then annexed by the state of Israel. And so this remained a core problem. But in addition to this core problem, Israel did not stop settlement activity. Since 1967, Israel continued to build settlements all through the Palestinian areas in order to allow for Jewish residents in areas that were militarily occupied. These settlements have been thought of by much of the international community as a major obstacle to peace. In addition, the Palestinians quickly saw, many of them, that this was leading nowhere, and so violence did not end. And there was a continuously ongoing cycle of violence, Palestinian violence, Israeli violence against one another, so that by the time we reach the year 2000, another major conflagration takes place, a second intifada that is again an attempt by the Palestinians to throw off Israeli rule, using a mixture of tactics, civil disobedience, very prominent in the first intifada between 1987 and to 1993, but also armed attacks on soldiers, on settlers, and sometimes within Israel on Israeli civilians. And then Israeli reaction, extensive reaction, not proportional to Palestinian violence. And so, of course, although that optimism had been sowed in those accords signed on the White House lawn, the wounds are still festering, as it seems that there are too many people that think that violence can lead to victory, and victory can lead to a resolution of the conflict. After the outbreak of the Gulf War and then going into the Second Intifada, we're talking about those years during the 1990s, the area knew new forms of extreme violence. Extreme violence meaning suicide bombings, bombings by Israeli Air Force of Palestinian targets in Gaza, extreme violence. And so the Israelis started to construct a separation wall. And again, if that separation wall had been along, and you see here a green line, if that separation wall had been along the green line, which is the internationally recognized border of the state of Israel, recognized according to the armistice lines of 1949, well, perhaps the international community would not have been able to say much, for the Israelis claimed that this wall was being built in order to defend Israeli lives, prevent Palestinians from infiltrating into Israeli territory. But as you can see, the wall was not built along the green line. And so, although the Israelis claim that it is a defense wall, many have argued, Palestinians and among the peace camp in Israel and among international community, that this wall is built not so much for defense, but to claim Palestinian territory, to keep Palestinians out of their own territory and make it available for more Jewish settlement and Jewish control. Now, when we look here at the area of Jerusalem, we see that the wall is indeed sometimes creating absurd situations where, for example, we see Palestinians encircled by walls around them that cut them off from Palestinian places of residence. Again, the Israelis could have built the wall along the Green Line, and that would have been with some kind of international legitimacy, but building the wall so that it encircles Palestinian communities, keeps Palestinians out of their land, allows for the building of settlements, has been very, very controversial. As we come towards the end of this presentation, I would like, by using this map, and I will focus on 4 of these maps, to show where we are in terms of territory. And the conflict is very, very much about territory. It is, of course, also about national identity. It's also about economics. But territory here is playing a very central role in defining the conflict. So in 1917, we see historic Palestine, defined in this map. Again, we remember that 1917 was the year when this territory passed from being ruled by the Turks, as it had been for 400 years already, to territory that would become part of the British Empire, a mandate handed to Britain to rule Palestine by the League of Nations. Okay, I'm going to jump over this, which was one of the proposals to split up the land, giving an area for the Jews and an area for the Arabs, but we'll go right over here to, once again, the United Nations, 29th of November, 1947, the aftermath of the Shoah, the recognition of Jewish suffering, not only during the Shoah, but for too long in too many places, the need for a Jewish homeland, and the proposal that 56% of Palestine would become that Jewish homeland. And alongside that Jewish homeland, some kind of recognition that in this land there is an indigenous people, a Palestinian Arab people that also has rights, and so an Arab state on 44% of the land. Again, that was only in theory. This was never put into practice. What became reality was the result of the 1947-1948 war, which ended in January 1949, where the Israeli state, internationally recognized as it is today, was formed on 78% of historical Palestine, the territory of historical Palestine. But in 1967, the rest of Palestine, the other 22%, was occupied by the Israelis. The Israelis, as a result of the 1967 war, established an occupation over the West Bank and over Gaza Strip. Now, it was supposed to change after 1993. It was supposed to change, giving the Palestinians a state. But they never succeeded in achieving a state. Israel resisted the implementation of those accords. Simmering resentment, outbursts in violence, revenge backwards and forwards has led not to a state, but to the fragmentation of what remains of Palestinian territory, a Gaza Strip cut off from the West Bank, one regime in Gaza Strip, another regime in the West Bank, and even in the West Bank, only few areas where there is some kind of Palestinian autonomy. Surrounded, those areas are by the Israeli armed forces. The shared rule is really not so shared, as Israel has the upper hand, much stronger partner, and much of the area still open to Israeli settlement and complete control by Israeli military. So this is a very dark situation. One more slide before we go into a time of questions and hopefully a clarification. 2 years ago, today is the 13th of September, so in 2 days' time, we will be marking 2 years since what was termed the Abraham Accords. Many, once again, thought this was a moment of optimism. The Trump administration in the United States had worked hard to bring together the Israeli government, here represented by the then Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, with Arab governments, here represented by the foreign ministers of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Under the symbolic figure of Abraham, it would seem to those looking from afar that Jews and Arabs could come together around the negotiating table. They could recognize one another and establish some kind of coexistence in the Middle East. But I'm afraid to say that many of us were profoundly disappointed by this supposed negotiation process. For after all, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, and later Sudan and Morocco and other countries that were dragged into this very strongly American-sponsored process, have no real problem with Israel. Yes, of course, as Arabs, they had voiced some kind of solidarity with the Palestinians, but it was a solidarity that never had any flesh. Now, 2020, the Trump administration is pushing so much shared interest, economic, military, shared interests among these regimes that are jointly, commonly hostile to Iran, are all facing a problem with terrorism. All are spying on their enemies. All are building very strong economies based upon really wild capitalism. And so these Abraham Accords, I would not associate at all with Abraham, at least not the Abraham of the Bible. These are accords based upon very, very strong shared self-interest of Israel and some of the most reactionary regimes in the Middle East. Not only that, but of course the Palestinians were not represented, were not consulted, were not brought into the process. And this again goes back to the argument that we have made for the past 55 minutes. It is really the Palestinian question that is at the very heart of the conflict that tears the Holy Land apart. And not only the Holy Land, but this whole region has been in a state of great instability since 1948. And this violence that is a consequence of this clash between two peoples trying to claim the same land and unwilling to share it is a violence that affects us all wherever we are. And this is where we are right now. I'm going to stop here so that we can open for questions. And Patricia, I turn back to you.
Thank you, David. That was very clear and very enlightening. It's good to go back to the beginning of the history, if that indeed is possible. The chat line is open for questions if anyone has them. Our first question: did religious Zionism come about after Israel was established under political Zionism?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. Religious Zionism precedes the establishment of the State of Israel, but let's perhaps trace it in a line that hopefully will be simple enough to follow. First of all, in a certain sense, Zionism, which is the longing for Jerusalem, is religious. And again, we're talking about Jewish religious Zionism. It is religious, meaning there is always a dream of Jerusalem. Every year during the Passover Seder, wherever Jews are, they remember Jerusalem, and they remember Jerusalem in daily prayer. So that there is a religious underpinning to what became a political movement in the late 19th century. But when political Zionism started to promote the idea of a Jewish homeland and migration to that Jewish homeland in the terms of 19th century nationalism, many, many religious Jews were absolutely horrified because, according to a very commonly held position, the return to Zion would be a messianic event. In other words, it would be instigated by God and only God. And any attempt to return to Zion that was not part of some divine plan and clearly revealed as a divine plan was seen as a rebellion against heaven. Now, there were those who challenged that, religious Jews who were attracted to the type of modern Jewish nationalism that developed at the end of the 19th century. One of the most important was a great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who became the first chief rabbi for the Ashkenazi Jews in Palestine after 1917. And he challenged that. He said, no. We as religious Jews, we can support nationalism under certain conditions. But again, I do want to stress that Zionism only conquered the majority of Jews in the world in the 1930s and 1940s. In other words, most religious Jews were very suspicious of Zionism. They saw it not only as a rebellion against heaven, but also as a very secular movement that was promising some kind of secular Jewish state. But also many secular Jews really believed that they did not need a homeland in some far-off distant place. They still believed, right until the Shoah, that there was a future for them in Europe, that anti-Semitism could be fought against. This would be the position, for instance, of someone like Edwin Montagu. And it was only after the Shoah that many, many Jews lost hope in living in a world that was defined by Christendom and that seemed to them to be sick to the core with anti-Semitism. So religious Zionism has been a part of the Zionist movement long before the State of Israel, and it continues to be a part today, with, of course, the danger whenever you bring God into politics, that makes for very, very difficult political argument when God is on your side, and sometimes even less willingness to dialogue and make compromise with those who you're in conflict with.
Why can't we see the Ottoman Empire as also having forcibly taken the land before the British did? Who should we?
Oh, absolutely. the land has been conquered and reconquered. Okay, I'm not in any way suggesting that the Ottomans have some kind of authentic claim to the Holy Land. Okay, so I mean, if we go all the way back, I don't know where you want to go back to, The land has been conquered and reconquered. So the Ottomans took over in 1516 and ruled for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's why I said, let's start in 1917, when that status quo of hundreds of years of being part of the Ottoman Empire ends. But of course, if we wanted to do a real history of the Holy Land, we could go back century before century before century and see how before the Ottomans, there were other Muslim regimes. There was that interlude of Crusaders, Western Christians conquering the land, a time of incredible violence. Before that, other Muslim regimes ruling the land. Before that, the Byzantines with short periods of Persian invasion. And we can go back and back and back and back and back. Okay. Now, it's interesting that the Bible records that the land was not always inhabited by the people of Israel. The land was conquered. And here we come to the very problematic language, which some Christians hold together with many Jews, that this land was promised by God. Again, I think that we need to recognize there that we are saying something that is very, very potent in a conflict situation when we start talking about God promised this land to one people. And that touches very, very much on how we interpret the Bible, how we understand what the Bible means today, and how we then use that religious discourse within the conflict. And there are very militant religious people, and there are people who are religious who are looking for ways of dialogue. But I think what we need to recognize is that we don't all hold the same religious beliefs. And that makes dialogue particularly vital when we're talking about the future of this land.
This reminds me of how the Native Americans were treated in North America, particularly in the US. Was the logic behind the division of territory in 1947 to give more territory, but also to isolate the Palestinian territories?
So, of course, that is an excellent question with our awareness today of the horrors of claiming land from indigenous people. But I do want to interject here something that needs to be taken seriously, and that is Jews do not feel that they are a colonial people. Jews have a very real sense that they are coming home when they come to this land. Palestinians reject that completely and see Jews as colonials who are coming into a land that is not their own. So this, of course, makes it a little different to how Europeans went to North America and took over the territory, or went to South America, or wherever they went, Africa, Asia. Zionists do not feel that they are colonialists. Palestinians insist very, very much that not only are Zionists colonials, but they allied themselves with the colonial empires. And this is, of course, one of those points of incredible debate and friction that makes dialogue sometimes very difficult. I do want to throw into that a recognition, again, that there were always Jews in Palestine. There were always Jews in the Holy Land. There were always Jews in the land that is now called Israel. But the big difference between the Jews who were always there and the Jews who came in under the leadership of the Zionist movement is that the Jews who were always there integrated into the majoritarian society. They were Arabic-speaking Jews. They felt part and parcel of a more general society that included Muslims and Christians. When the Zionist movement came in, of course, it set up an identity that did not allow for that kind of integration into the area. And so again, I think that when we speak about the Jewish presence in the land, we need to make that distinction. Again, in the modern period, Jews affiliating themselves with something that can be easily seen as colonialism, and an ancient Jewish presence that saw itself very much as part of the fabric of Middle Eastern society.
Who should we consider indigenous? Are these good questions to consider when looking at the problem?
So I hope that that question was answered by my answer to the last question. In other words, when we put the question of indigenous, it's already inflammatory. Because although no one can claim that the Palestinians are not indigenous, I shouldn't say no one can claim. People, very right-wing supporters of Zionism, have claimed that the Palestinians are not indigenous, that they migrated. I think that's nonsense. But what is sometimes inflammatory is to say that the Jews are not indigenous when they feel indigenous. Now, again, what does it mean that someone says, I feel indigenous? But we do, all of us recognize, and Palestinians recognize that as well, the Jewish community has always been a part of this land. The Jewish community as a community is not foreign to this land. What is very, very problematic, what Palestinians cannot accept, is the idea that the Jewish people should rule the land in an exclusive way.
What are the current populations of Jews and Palestinians?
Okay, so that's something that we'll go into a little bit more detail when we begin next time, but I will already say that it's very interesting to consider the question of population. If we take the territory of historic Palestine, meaning from the Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, we have more or less in Palestine, Israel today, a population of 14 million people. 14 million. 7 million of them are Jews, Jewish Israelis, and 7 million of them are Palestinians. 5 million Palestinians within the territories that are occupied by Israel, and 2 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, who are the descendants of those Palestinians who stayed in the state of Israel after the state of Israel was formed as a state. Now that makes for a very, very interesting vision of what is Israel-Palestine today when we say, wow, it's the same number of Jews and the same number of Palestinian Arabs living in this territory today.
In Canada, the Indian Act of 1867 and its terminology has been criticized by many as paternalistic. The Indigenous peoples of Canada being viewed by the federal government as wards of the state. In your very clear description of the history of the conflict, how would you describe the nature of the agreements and accords that have left the Palestinians and their autonomy out of the dialogue? Can you put this into the context of an era of international colonialism?
So again, I think that I will give a fuller answer next week when we deal with the present and future situation. But I think that we can see from the description that I've given, and again, I'm not sure everybody would agree with my description, but what I'm basically proposing is the Palestinians have gotten a very, very bad deal, like many colonized peoples. Again, I'm not immediately saying Zionism is colonialism. Okay, I do recognize the Jewish sense that they belong to this land as well. But here we are focusing specifically on the fate of the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian people have been repeatedly ignored. If we go back to the Balfour Declaration, okay, which I think in many senses is foundational to everything that happened afterwards, the main concern of Arthur Balfour and David Lloyd George was for the suffering Jewish people, especially in Eastern Europe, and that they would have a homeland. They linked that with their biblical faith that God has given a land to this people. This land is Palestine. And they put that within the colonial context of we are the Lord's, we can decide the fate of that land. In all of that, the Palestinians were never even considered. It is very interesting to historically identify Edwin Montague as that voice of opposition to this way of thinking. first of all, as the Secretary for India, perhaps, okay, this is maybe me imagining too much, perhaps recognizing already then a certain evil in colonial rule in India, but even more as a Jew saying, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? My homeland is England. My homeland is not some far off land that I've never been to and that I'm not particularly interested in going to. But it was because of Edwin Montagu that that second part of the Balfour Declaration was added. And that part said, the Jewish homeland will be implemented without endangering or limiting the rights of the indigenous people. Again, I'm not quoting, but that's the idea of the second paragraph. So it was an afterthought. And so interesting, it was the afterthought of a Jewish opponent to what was being proposed in the Balfour Declaration. And then over the years of the British mandatory rule, the first Governor General of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, was a British Jew, very much enthusiastic with the Zionist idea. But it took the British decades to realize that this people in the land, these Palestinian Arabs, were again being ignored. By the time they recognized that, it was already too late. The process had been set in motion that led to a civil war of incredible violence. But then again, the argument was hijacked, and I use that word with fear and trepidation, because it was hijacked by the Shoah. I mean, who can stand before the Shoah and not recognize the suffering of the Jewish people? The suffering of a people that the Nazis had wanted to genocide, to put to death. Surely this people has a place in the world. And again, the whole question of Palestine vanished under the cloud of the Shoah. Now, again, I'm not in any way saying there is a parallel between Shoah and Nakba, but they converge. They converge in this place in 1948, where the world decides, to the cheering of the people in Palestine who are Jewish, that the Jews deserve a homeland. But again, the Palestinians they're not on the map. And it's going to take decades for the Palestinians to get themselves on the map. Now, again, we are very angry at the Palestinians that they did not accept the 1947 partition of Palestine. But we expected them to accept it at a time that other indigenous people were getting their independence. We were very angry with the Palestinians when they started to shout, when they started to act up, when they started to commit acts of terrorism. But if they don't shout out, we ignore them completely. So, I mean, here we have created a very, very problematic dynamic in which are we more aware today that we have left a whole people with no homeland, with no hope.
Is there anything a Christian can do to help the Palestinian people find a home in the Holy Land? Awareness, reading, books, or people
so
we
again,
should listen to?
I'm going to go into that a lot more next week. But I will say that there are many things a Christian can do. The first thing is to become aware. Okay, and I think that we as Christians have a particular responsibility to become aware. Because let us remember that if it had not been for a Christian teaching of contempt for the Jewish people over centuries, and a Christian practice, again, it's not Christian at all, but Christians who practiced exclusion, discrimination, persecution of Jews, this is what has created a need by Jews to have their own homeland. Okay, again, I'm not saying that there's not a religious longing for Zion. Some Jews might even have moved to Zion, But what we're talking about in the 20th century is this absolute determination to control the Holy Land and to make it a Jewish state. Again, we'll look at this a little more next week. What does that mean, a Jewish state? What does that mean in terms of people who are not Jewish? All of this will come up in our discussion when we go on with where are we and where are we going. So I think that it's very, very important. Part and parcel of what we need to do is to be aware. Now, we need to be aware of what exactly? I would say, from a historical point of view, we must become aware of our teaching of contempt for Jews. We must become aware of our fear and hatred of Muslims so that we can not make that part of our discourse. That when we speak about Israel, Palestine, when we speak about the Holy Land, when we lobby for Palestinians and their rights, we are not doing that with any hint of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, colonialism, the desire to impose our vision of things. Okay. Second, I think that we really need to, I am a professor of Bible. I love the Bible. I live from the Bible. For me, really, finding the word of God in the Bible is the religious act par excellence. But we need to recognize that the Bible has been used in the most horrific ways in a whole slew of different situations with regard to women, with regard to LGBT, with regard to people of color, with regard to slavery, with regard to all kinds of economic, political ideologies, but also with regard to what's going on in Israel, Palestine today. We need to go back and look at the Bible and make sure that it is a word of God, meaning a word of life, a word of hope for the people of Israel, Palestine, all of them, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians. And then third, and I think this is also very, very important, we need to recognize, and again, I don't know who's listening in and which countries they're coming from, but we need to recognize that what is going on in Israel, Palestine today is not decided in Israel, Palestine. It's decided in Washington, D.C., in London, in Berlin, in Rome, in Paris, in Moscow. We who live in those countries must be out there to make sure that the people that we elect, if we have the possibility to elect, and in most of the countries I mentioned, we do, are as aware as we want to be of the catastrophe that has been ongoing in this country. So I think that there are many, many things that we can do.
What is taught in history in schools in both territories?
So I could give a few seminars just on that. And I say that because I have on different occasions been asked by the church, both local and universal, to go through the textbooks to see what is being taught about the other in the textbooks. And it's not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture in either of the textbook. There is a lot of press focus on the Palestinian textbooks, and that the Palestinian textbooks do not teach coexistence and acceptance of Jews, and do not teach a lot about Jewish history and Jewish suffering. It's absolutely true, they don't. Certainly not. I would not want my children to learn with those textbooks. But I'm going to say something that is harsh, but I say it from my heart. The Palestinian textbooks are a mirror image of the Israeli textbooks. Okay? Now, the Israeli textbooks are not being debated because the Israeli textbooks are not published with funds that come from outside. The Palestinian textbooks are. And so Israeli spokespeople and very strong supporters of Israel are making usually extremely exaggerated claims about the Palestinian textbooks, that they do not teach coexistence with Jews and with Israel. And I will say that when it's not potent exaggeration, there's some degree of truth to that. They don't. They focus a lot on Palestinian suffering. But again, I will repeat that they are a mirror image of the Israeli textbooks. And there is not yet a real attempt to educate our children, meaning Israeli children, Palestinian children, to live together, to see each other as a full human reality that makes this land richer and not poorer.
I understand that you may be answering this question next week, but is it possible that some form of peace could come to this region with integration of the people similar to the Ottoman Empire?
Well, we have a number of obstacles to overcome. One of the things that was a unifier at the time of the Ottomans was that basically everyone spoke the same language. Everyone listened to the same music. Everyone basically ate the same food. There was a cultural, social context that brought people together without, of course, when they went to pray. So one went to a church, one went to a mosque, one went to a synagogue. So there were religious divisions that were also important divisions because people tended not to intermarry. Okay, families tended to keep to them, to keep within themselves. But there was a common socio-cultural linguistic framework in which people were able to interchange. That came to an end in the 20th century. That came to an end in the 1930s, 1940s, where we have now very strong national identities, and the two national identities are Jewish Israeli and Palestinian Arab. And that also means different languages, different understandings of culture, different understandings of history, different narratives, where the narratives do not really converge. So whereas in the 19th century and before, there would be narratives that would bring people together. And by the way, this is well known. People frequented each other's feasts. And there are still old people who remember that, who have memories. How much time do we have? Can I tell a story that me is,
of course.
And it's related to this. One day I was coming back from the occupied territories where I work, and it was a Jewish feast day. We haven't said this clearly yet, so I'm going to say it now. By national identification, I'm an Israeli, and by ethnic identification, I'm a Jew. So I'm an Israeli Jew who became a Catholic, now a Jesuit. I speak fluent Arabic, and I work in Arabic-speaking educational institutions. I was coming back from teaching in Bethlehem, Palestine. And it was a Jewish feast, so there was a closure of passage from Palestine to Israel, and that affects many, many people, but affected on this particular day that I'm talking about, a very old lady, she must have been in her early 80s, who was walking down the road with a huge basket of fruit on her head because she had to go to Jerusalem to sell the fruit to make money for her family, who was not allowed to pass into Israel because of the Jewish feast. Now, strictly forbidden to pick her up. The soldiers had let her through because she was old and she was a woman. And so she was walking to Jerusalem. I, against the law, stopped the car, picked her up, and spoke to her in Arabic. Of course, I'm dressed as a Catholic priest. I'm speaking in Arabic. And she told me that she had been already walking for 5 hours, that she had left her village at 6 in the morning. This was now 11 o'clock in the morning. So, playing, as I love to do in this situation, I pretended that I was, a young Palestinian. I was speaking to her in Arabic. I'm much younger than her. I said to her, grandmother, tell me, why are all the roads closed? You couldn't get to Jerusalem. I don't understand why all the roads closed. Because I wanted to hear what she would say. What would be her way of interpreting reality? And I was completely floored by her response. Okay, this old woman who had been walking 5 hours, whose family could not pass because the Israelis had imposed this complete curfew, not a curfew, but stopped all Palestinians from entering Israel. She looked at me with a kind of sad look and she said, "My son, you're too young to remember." I said, "Grandmother, what are you talking about? What should I remember?" And she said, "If you were my age, you would remember exactly what feast this is." And it was the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. And she started to explain to me in detail what the Feast of Tabernacles means for the Jewish people. And as she was going on, I said to her, "Grandmother, wait one second. How do you know all this?" And she said, "That's why I'm so sad for you, my son, because you don't remember the time when we used to go to their feasts and they used to come to our feasts." Okay, so there was that level of integration. It was not perfect. There were tensions, whatever you want, but there was a commonality, a sense that we belong at least to the same city, at least to the same region. And that commonality is what has been completely lost and which we need to seek to repair. And that's perhaps where we might be able to go next week when we look at maybe some of the ways in which we can try to struggle.
David, thank you. I don't think we can take any more questions today. There are many other questions, but most of them do relate to next week anyway. So we will keep those questions and ask them to you next week. Thank you very much for your time, scholarship, passion, and balanced presentation. We look forward to seeing everybody next week on Tuesday, September 20th for part 2. And a note, someone mentioned racism and slavery. I think it was you, David. In December, we have a webinar on slavery and racism in the Catholic Church with Christopher Kellerman, who is an American Jesuit. So thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I'd also like to thank Jose Sanchez, Fanny, and our translators, Michelle and Albert, for ensuring that all of our tech issues were working. And I'll turn it over to Jose before we end.
Yes, and just 2 reminders, as Patricia said, we'll be hosting another session in December. We don't have the registration page ready, but watch out for that in your email. If you sign up for this session, you should be able to get, you will get a copy to that page so that you can register for that session. And the second reminder is that, as we've said throughout the session, or at the beginning of the session and posted in the chat, the recordings for this and the next session with David will be shared with you by 72 hours after the webinar. So 72 hours from today, you will get the copy for the first session, and then the copy for the second session 72 hours after the second session ends. Thank you, Pat.
And in October, we have a webinar on Canadian Indigenous issues and reflections on Pope Francis's visit. That is in October, so look for that. Thank you, David, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.